1894 studio photo resurfaces. Experts turn pale after spotting the symbol made by the bride's hand. The photograph arrived at the Chicago Historical Museum on a Tuesday morning in October 2024, nestled inside a worn leather portfolio that smelled of dust and time. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the museum's lead curator of Victorian-era collections, carefully lifted the image from its protective sleeve. The studio portrait showed a bride and groom posed in the formal style of 1894, she in an elaborate white gown with leg of mutton sleeves, he in a dark suit with a high collar. The couple stared directly at the camera with the stiff, unsmiling expressions typical of long exposure times. Sarah had examined thousands of such photographs during her 15-year career, but something about this one made her pause. The composition was standard, the groom standing, one hand on the bride's shoulder, the bride seated on an ornate chair. Yet there was a quality in the woman's eyes, a tension that seemed to contradict the serene arrangement of her features. "What do you think?" asked Marcus Chen, the museum's digital preservation specialist, leaning over her shoulder. He had been scanning Victorian photographs all week, preparing them for the museum's online archive. "It's beautiful," Sarah replied, tilting the image toward the light. "The clarity is exceptional for the period. Look at the detail in the lace." Marcus moved closer, his eyes narrowing. That studio stamp on the back, Whitmore & Sons, State Street. They were one of the most prominent photography studios in Chicago during the 1890s. This could be valuable. Sarah turned the photograph over. The studio's embossed mark was still visible, along with a handwritten notation. "Mr. and Mrs. William Ashford, September 14, 1894. She flipped it back to the front, studying the couple again. The bride couldn't have been more than 20 years old, her dark hair elaborately styled, her posture perfect. But her hands, resting in her lap, were positioned in an unusual way, the left hand placed over the right, fingers interlaced in a specific pattern. "Can you scan this at the highest resolution?" Sarah asked, passing the photograph to Marcus. "I want to examine every detail." "Sure thing," Marcus said, heading toward his workstation. "Should have it ready by this afternoon." Sarah watched him go, unable to shake the feeling that this photograph held secrets far beyond its surface beauty. 3 hours later, Sarah stood before her computer screen, zooming in on the high-resolution scan Marcus had delivered. The image was extraordinary, every thread of the bride's gown, every shadow on the studio backdrop, rendered in perfect clarity. But it was the hands that held Sarah's attention. She had been right. The positioning was deliberate. The bride's left hand lay over her right, but not in the relaxed, natural way one might expect. The fingers were carefully arranged, the left thumb pressed against the right palm, the index and middle fingers extended, while the others curled inward. It was too precise to be accidental, too controlled to be comfortable. Sarah pulled up her research database and began searching through documentation of Victorian hand gestures and symbolism. She found references to the language of flowers, fan signals, and even handkerchief codes, all the subtle ways Victorian women communicated in an era when direct speech was often constrained by social convention. But nothing matched what she was seeing in the photograph. Her phone rang. It was Dr. James Morrison, a colleague from Northwestern University who specialized in 19th century social movements. "James, I need your expertise," Sarah said, skipping pleasantries. "Have you ever come across any kind of hand signal or gesture used by women in the 1890s? Something that might appear in formal photographs?" There was a pause. "What kind of signal are we talking about?" Sarah described the positioning of the bride's hands in detail. She heard James inhale sharply. "Send me the image," he said, his voice suddenly urgent. "Right now." Sarah's fingers moved quickly across the keyboard, attaching the scan and hitting send. She could hear James typing on the other end of the line. "Got it," he said. A moment of silence. Then, "Sarah, where did you get this photograph?" "It was donated to the museum." "Why? What is it?" "That hand position," James said slowly, "matches descriptions I've found in letters and journals from women who were trafficked or held against their will in the late 19th century. It was a distress signal, a way to communicate that they needed help without alerting their captors." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. "You're certain?" "I need to verify it against my sources. But yes, if this is what I think it is, that woman in the photograph was signaling for rescue." Sarah spent the next morning in the museum's archive basement, pulling every record she could find related to Whitmore & Sons photography studio. The studio had operated on State Street from 1887 to 1902, one of dozens serving Chicago's growing population during the city's rapid expansion after the Great Fire of 1871. Marcus joined her, carrying his laptop and a stack of reference books. "James called me this morning," he said, settling into a chair across from her work table. He sent over some documents. You need to see these. He opened his laptop and turned the screen towards Sarah. The document was a scanned page from a journal dated 1896, written in careful cursive script. The author identified herself only as EM and described her work with what she called the Silent Network, a loose coalition of sympathetic individuals who helped women escape situations of exploitation and forced servitude. Sarah read aloud, "We developed signals that could be passed unnoticed by those who held these women captive. A specific arrangement of the hands during a photograph, a particular way of holding a parasol, even the angle at which a hat was worn, all could convey a desperate plea for assistance. The photographers were often our most valuable allies, as they alone could preserve these signals and pass them to those who knew how to interpret them." Photography studios? Marcus said quietly. They were part of the rescue network. Sarah sat back, her mind racing. It makes sense. A woman forced into marriage or servitude would have limited opportunities to communicate freely. But a formal photograph was socially acceptable, even expected. If the photographer was sympathetic, they could preserve the signal and pass it along to people who could help, Marcus finished. He pulled up another document. James found references to at least 6 photographers in Chicago who were known to be part of this network. Whitmore and Sons was one of them. Sarah looked back at the photograph of the bride, seeing it now with completely different eyes. This wasn't just a formal wedding portrait. It was a cry for help, frozen in silver and light, waiting 130 years to be heard. "We need to find out who she was," Sarah said. "The notation on the back says Mr. and Mrs. William Ashford, September 1894. Let's start there." The Cook County marriage records for September 1894 yielded no results for a William Ashford. Sarah expanded her search to include the entire state of Illinois, then the surrounding states. Nothing. It was as if the couple in the photograph had never existed. "That's not uncommon," said Rebecca Palmer, the museum's genealogy specialist, when Sarah consulted her the next day. Names were often misspelled in official records, or sometimes changed entirely. And if this was a case of trafficking or forced marriage, the names on the photograph might have been false from the beginning. Rebecca pulled up a database on her computer. "Let's approach this differently. You said the studio was Whitmore and Sons on State Street. Let me check the city directories for that period." She typed rapidly, then nodded. "Here we are. Whitmore and Sons, 342 State Street. The owner was Thomas Whitmore, and he had 2 sons working with him, George and Daniel. The studio was known for high-quality portraiture and served a wealthy clientele." She scrolled down. "Interesting. Thomas Whitmore was also listed as a member of the Chicago Reform Club, a progressive organization that advocated for labor rights and social reform. So he would have had connections to activist networks," Sarah said. "Very likely." Rebecca continued searching. "Let me see if I can find anything about the Whitmore family in newspaper archives." 20 minutes later, she had an answer. "Look at this. From the Chicago Tribune, November 1894, 2 months after the date on your photograph. Prominent photographer questioned in missing persons case. It's just a brief mention, but it says Thomas Whitmore was interviewed by police regarding the disappearance of a young woman who had recently been photographed at his studio." Sarah leaned forward. "Does it give her name?" "No, and there's no follow-up article. But there's something else." Rebecca pulled up another document. A letter to the editor published a week later, unsigned, defending Whitmore's character and suggesting that the missing woman had found her way to safety through the assistance of concerned citizens. "That's pretty specific language." Marcus, who had been listening from across the room, spoke up. If the rescue network helped her escape, they wouldn't want attention drawn to their methods. An unsigned letter vouching for the photographer's innocence while hinting that the woman was safe. That sounds like damage control. Sarah studied the photograph again, this time focusing on the groom. His face was stern, his hand on the bride's shoulder possessive rather than affectionate. "We need to find out who this man really was." Dr. James Morrison arrived from Northwestern the following morning, carrying a briefcase full of research materials. He spread documents across Sarah's work table, journal entries, letters, newspaper clippings, all relating to human trafficking and forced servitude in late 19th century Chicago. The problem was massive, James explained, pointing to a labor statistics report from 1893. Young women, many of them immigrants, were lured to cities with promises of legitimate employment. Instead, they found themselves trapped in domestic servitude, forced into marriages with men who essentially purchased them. Or worse, the networks that exploited them were sophisticated and well protected by corrupt officials. He pulled out a leather-bound journal. This belonged to a woman named Catherine Wells, who worked as a social reformer in Chicago during the 1890s. She documented dozens of cases and worked with the rescue network your photograph appears to be connected to. Sarah carefully turned the journal's yellowed pages. Catherine's handwriting was precise, her observations detailed and heartbreaking. Women held in basement rooms, their documents confiscated. Girls as young as 14 forced into marriages with men 3 times their age. The complicity of employment agencies, boarding house operators, even some clergy members. Here, James said, pointing to an entry dated August 1894, 1 month before the photograph was taken. Catherine mentions a case involving a young woman from Ohio who was brought to Chicago under false pretenses. She was to be married to a man she'd never met, a businessman who had essentially purchased her from a labor broker. Catherine and her network were trying to intervene. Sarah read the entry aloud. The girl is terrified, but clever. We have arranged for her to visit Whitmore's studio for a wedding portrait. If she can signal her willingness to accept help, we will move on the day following the photograph. The timing must be precise, as her captor is suspicious and watches her constantly. Do you think this is her? Marcus asked, looking at the photograph on Sarah's computer screen. The dates match, James said, and the signal is clear. But we need more proof. Sarah turned to Rebecca. Can you search for any Ohio newspaper reports about young women going missing or traveling to Chicago around that time? We need a name. Rebecca's fingers flew across her keyboard. Give me an hour. Rebecca found it in the archives of the Cleveland Plain Dealer, a small notice dated July 1894. Miss Eleanor Shaw, age 19, has departed for Chicago to take up a position as a governess with a respectable family. Her parents wish her well in this new endeavor. Eleanor Shaw, Sarah whispered, studying the bride's face in the photograph. The name felt right, as if it had been waiting all these years to be spoken again. James pulled up Catherine Wells's journal again, flipping through pages. Here, September 1894. E.S. successfully extracted. She is safe in Milwaukee with friends of the cause. The man who claimed ownership of her has been told she perished in a railway accident. He did not inquire further, which tells us everything about his character. The photograph remains as evidence, should it ever be needed. E.S., Marcus said. Eleanor Shaw. Sarah felt a chill. They faked her death. That's how they got her out safely. It was a common tactic, James explained. If the traffickers thought their victim was dead, they wouldn't search for her. The network would provide new papers, a new identity. Eleanor Shaw effectively ceased to exist on September 15, 1894, 1 day after this photograph was taken. Rebecca was already searching for more. If she went to Milwaukee, there might be records of her there under a different name, but we'd need to know what identity she assumed. Sarah studied the photograph with new understanding. This wasn't just a wedding portrait. It was evidence, carefully preserved by people who risked everything to help a desperate woman. The formal pose, the elaborate staging, it all served to make the photograph appear legitimate while hiding its true purpose. The man in the photograph, Sarah said, looking at the groom's stern face. William Ashford. That has to be a false name, too. The network wouldn't have wanted to preserve his real identity. Agreed, James said. But someone, somewhere, knew who he really was. The question is whether those records still exist. Sarah made a decision. We need to go to Milwaukee. If Eleanor Shaw built a new life there, if she had family, descendants, there might be records, photographs, journals, something that could confirm her identity and tell us what happened after she escaped. Marcus was already pulling up train schedules on his phone. I can have us there by tomorrow morning. Do it, Sarah said, her eyes still on Eleanor's face in the photograph, on the young woman who had been brave enough to signal for help and trust that someone would see. The Milwaukee County Historical Society occupied a renovated warehouse near the river. Sarah, Marcus, and James arrived just after 9, where they were greeted by Linda Kowalski, the Society's research director. Your email was intriguing, Linda said, leading them through corridors lined with archival boxes. We don't get many inquiries about the 1890s rescue networks. Most people don't even know they existed. She opened a door to a climate-controlled research room. I pulled everything we have related to women's aid societies and reform movements from that period. It's not comprehensive. Many of these organizations operated in secret for obvious reasons, but there are fragments. Sarah explained what they had discovered about Eleanor Shaw and the photograph. Linda listened intently, occasionally making notes. The name Shaw doesn't immediately ring bells, Linda said, but that doesn't mean she wasn't here. Many women who were helped by these networks adopted completely new identities. Sometimes they took the surnames of their rescuers, or chose names from literature, or simply invented something entirely new. She pulled out a ledger. This belonged to the Milwaukee Women's Refuge, which operated from 1889 to 1903. They provided temporary housing for women in crisis. The entries are vague, just initials, dates of arrival and departure, sometimes a brief note about the circumstances. Sarah scanned the pages, her heart sinking. There were dozens of entries, most identifying women only by their initials. Then, on a page dated September 16, 1894, she found it. E.S. arrived from Chicago, age 19, referral from T.W. seeking permanent placement. T.W., Marcus said. Thomas Whitmore. This is her, Sarah said, her voice trembling with certainty. She arrived in Milwaukee the day after the photograph was taken. Linda looked over Sarah's shoulder. There's a note in the margin. See? It says, placed with Meyer family, October 1894. The Meyers were a prominent German immigrant family here. They owned a successful bakery and were known for their progressive views and charitable work. James was already searching on his laptop. I'm finding several Meyer families in Milwaukee during that period. We need to narrow it down, probably looking for a family with the means to support another person and the social connections to the reform movement. Try Frederick and Anna Meyer, Linda suggested. They lived on Prospect Avenue and were heavily involved in the German Reformed Church, which had strong ties to labor and women's rights movements. Rebecca, who had stayed behind in Chicago but was connected via video call on Marcus's laptop, spoke up. I'm searching Milwaukee city directories and census records. Give me a moment. The room fell silent except for the sound of keyboards clicking. Sarah stared at the ledger entry, imagining Eleanor Shaw's journey, escaping Chicago in the middle of the night, arriving in Milwaukee with nothing but the clothes on her back and the hope that strangers would help her. Got something, Rebecca said. The 1900 census lists Frederick and Anna Meyer, their 3 children, and a woman named Helen Morrison, age 25, listed as boarder and bakery assistant. No previous address given. Helen Morrison, Sarah said softly. A new name, a new life. The Meyer family bakery no longer existed, but the building that had housed it still stood on a quiet street in Milwaukee's historic district. It was now a boutique coffee shop, but the original brick facade and large windows remained. Sarah stood on the sidewalk, looking up at the building, trying to imagine Eleanor Shaw, now Helen Morrison, working here, kneading dough, serving customers, slowly building a life free from fear. The current owners might have historical information about the building, Marcus suggested. Worth asking. Inside, the coffee shop retained some original features: exposed brick walls, the old wooden floor, a decorative tin ceiling. A young woman behind the counter smiled at them. Welcome. What can I get for you? Sarah ordered coffee for everyone, then asked, Do you know anything about the history of this building? We're researching a woman who might have worked here in the 1890s. The woman's eyes lit up. Oh, you should talk to Mrs. Chen. Sorry, Mrs. Morrison Chen. She's actually upstairs right now. She owns the building and her family has owned it for generations. Let me call her. Sarah's pulse quickened. Morrison Chen. Could it be? A few minutes later, an elderly woman descended the narrow stairs at the back of the shop. She was perhaps 80, with silver hair and bright, intelligent eyes. She carried herself with remarkable grace. I'm Patricia Morrison Chen, she said, extending her hand. I understand you're asking about the building's history? Sarah introduced herself and her colleagues, explaining about the photograph and their research into Eleanor Shaw. Patricia's expression grew very still. Please, she said quietly, come upstairs. They followed her up to a spacious apartment filled with antiques and family photographs. Patricia gestured for them to sit, then disappeared into another room. She returned carrying an old wooden box. My great-grandmother's name was Helen Morrison, Patricia said, settling into a chair. But that wasn't her original name. She never spoke much about her life before she came to Milwaukee, but my grandmother told me that Helen had escaped from a terrible situation in Chicago. She found safety with the Meyer family and eventually married their son, my great-grandfather Carl. She opened the wooden box carefully. Inside were letters, documents, and photographs. Helen lived until 1957. She was 92 when she died, and she was the strongest, kindest person I ever knew. Before she passed, she gave my grandmother this box and made her promise to keep it safe. She said that someday, someone might come looking for the truth. Patricia lifted out a photograph. It was Eleanor Shaw, unmistakably the same woman from the 1894 studio portrait, but older, perhaps 30, standing next to a young man in front of the bakery. She was smiling genuinely this time, her eyes full of life and hope. "This is Helen and my great-grandfather Carl on their wedding day 1905, Patricia said. She kept only one photograph from before. She reached deeper into the box and pulled out a familiar image, the 1894 studio portrait. Patricia laid the studio portrait on the table beside the later photograph. The contrast was striking, the same woman, but transformed. In 1894, her eyes held fear disguised as composure. By 1905, they radiated peace. Helen kept this photograph hidden for years, Patricia explained. My grandmother said Helen would sometimes take it out late at night and just look at it. She never explained why, but now I think I understand. It was proof of who she had been and what she had survived. Sarah carefully photographed both images, documenting them side by side. Did your great-grandmother ever talk about how she escaped? Not in detail, Patricia said. But she did tell my grandmother about a photographer in Chicago who had helped her, a man named Thomas Whitmore. She said he was brave and kind, and that he risked his business and his freedom to help women like her. James leaned forward. Did she ever say who the man in the photograph was? The one posing as her husband? Patricia's expression darkened. She called him the broker. Apparently, he wasn't the actual person who had claimed ownership of her. He was just a stand-in for the photograph, someone the real captor hired because he didn't want his own face preserved. The real man was someone powerful, someone with connections. That's why the rescue had to be so carefully planned. And the hand signal? Sarah asked. Did she ever explain that? She told my grandmother that she learned it from another woman in the boarding house where she was held, a woman who had tried to escape before and failed. That woman taught Helen the signal and told her that if she ever got the chance to have her photograph taken, she should use it. Someone would see it, and someone would help. Patricia reached into the box again and pulled out a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. Helen wrote this in 1953 when she was in her 80s. She wanted to make sure her story was preserved, even if she never told it aloud. Sarah unfolded the paper carefully. Helen's handwriting was shaky but clear. My name was Eleanor Shaw. I was 19 years old when I was brought to Chicago under false pretenses and told I would be married to a man I had never met. I was terrified and saw no way out. But there were people who refused to let me be forgotten. People who risked everything to help a stranger. Mr. Whitmore and his family, Mrs. Wells and her network, the Myers who gave me a home and a future. They saved my life. This photograph is my testimony. I survived. The room fell silent. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. She lived a full life, Patricia said softly. She and Carl had 4 children. She worked in the bakery for 30 years, became a beloved figure in the neighborhood, helped other women who found themselves in difficult situations. She died peacefully, surrounded by family. That man who tried to own her, he didn't win. She won. Back in Chicago, Sarah stood in the museum's exhibition hall, watching as technicians hung the 1894 studio portrait in a place of honor. Beside it, they mounted the 1905 wedding photograph Patricia had generously donated, along with Helen's written testimony. The exhibition was titled Silent Signals, Chicago's Hidden Rescue Network, 1890-1905. It told a story of the photographers, social reformers, and ordinary citizens who had worked in secret to help women escape exploitation and forced servitude. Eleanor Shaw's story anchored the exhibition, but James and Rebecca had uncovered evidence of at least 30 other women who had been helped by similar networks during that period. Marcus joined Sarah, holding a tablet displaying the exhibition's digital companion. We're already getting messages from people who think they might have family connections to the rescue network. One woman in Boston found a photograph of her great-great-aunt with the same hand signal. Another from Philadelphia discovered letters mentioning Thomas Whitmore. This is bigger than we realized, Sarah said. James approached, carrying a stack of newspapers. The story's gone national. The Times, the Post, even international outlets. People are fascinated by the idea of these hidden signals, these networks of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Sarah looked at Eleanor's face in the 1894 photograph, at the careful positioning of her hands that had waited 130 years to be understood. She deserves to be remembered. They all do. The exhibition opened to the public the following week. Thousands of visitors came to see the photographs and learn about the rescue network. Students studied the hand signals and the history of human trafficking. Descendants of both victims and rescuers connected with each other, sharing family stories that had been kept secret for generations. Patricia Morrison Chen attended the opening, bringing her entire extended family. She stood before her great-grandmother's photographs, tears streaming down her face. She would be so proud, Patricia said to Sarah. Not just that her story is being told, but that it's helping people understand that these things happened and that ordinary people fought back. As Sarah watched the crowds move through the exhibition, reading the stories, studying the photographs, she thought about the power of a single image. The 1894 studio portrait had seemed like just another Victorian wedding photograph, destined to be forgotten in an archive. But because Eleanor Shaw had been brave enough to signal for help, because Thomas Whitmore had been willing to preserve that signal, because a network of people had refused to look away, the photograph had become something more. It was testimony. It was resistance. It was hope. And now, finally, it was understood.